At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Micah Green, Professor of Chemical Engineering and President of the Christian Faculty Network here at Texas A&M, to introduce our speakers for this evening.
Thanks, Sam. We have two great speakers for you tonight. First, I'll introduce Professor Robert Garcia, who's on the faculty of philosophy at Baylor University. Previously, he taught here at Texas A&M for many years and taught a very popular class on the work and philosophy of C.S. Lewis. He is the co-editor of Is Goodness Without God Good Enough? A debate on faith, secularism, and ethics, and is published widely. He works primarily in analytic metaphysics and philosophy of religion, with a special interest in the metaphysics of properties, objects, and persons. And he's currently writing a book on C.S. Lewis's views about the uniqueness of persons. He holds a master's in philosophy of religion from Talbot School of Theology and a PhD in philosophy from Notre Dame. He previously taught here at Texas A&M, and like I said, and tonight he's going to be in dialogue with our first speaker, Dr. Moreland, about the topic, followed by Q&A via Slido that Sam just mentioned. But our first speaker tonight is going to be Dr. J.P. Moreland. We are really delighted to have him joining us. He is the distinguished professor of philosophy at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. He has a bachelor's in physical chemistry from the University of Missouri, a master's in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, a master's in philosophy from UC Riverside, and a PhD from the University of Southern California. He has spoken on and debated on over 200 college campuses and taught in 500 or so churches around the world. In addition, he has authored, edited, or contributed papers to 95 books, including Does God Exist?, Consciousness and the Existence of God, the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, the Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism, and Debating Christian Theism. Let me go ahead and let you know, he does have a handout for tonight's lecture. You can see it here on the upper right. In addition to the books I just mentioned, he's also published over 85 journal articles. To give you a sense of Dr. Moreland's accomplishments, in 2016, he was selected by the best schools as one of the 50 most influential living philosophers in the world. Tonight's topic is the hard problem of consciousness and its implications for naturalism and the existence of the soul. And he's actually published a book on this specific topic, which is available wherever you can buy books, like Amazon, places like that. It's called The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. So if you'd like to learn more, once tonight has concluded, that's a great place to start. With that, I'm happy to turn the floor over to our guest, Dr. J.P. Moreland. Let's join me in welcoming Dr. Moreland. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Green. It's so good to be with you. I had the privilege of coming to Texas A&M about 20 years ago to lecture live at a Veritas forum, and I've always loved Texas A&M. Believe it or not, I've always pulled for you, especially when you play the University of Texas. And I think that A&M should have been in the Final Four this year in football, but nobody asked me my opinion on that vote. You should have a handout, and I hope that you will get that because I think it will help you follow what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, by way of introduction, there is in our culture today a presumption of what I call physicalism, and it is so widespread that it's actually in the drinking water. I mean, all you have to do is to just live in this culture, and you come to believe that the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, and in particular neuroscience, has pretty much demonstrated that conscious states are actually the same thing as brain states, states that occur in the brain that are physical, and that the bearer or possessor of consciousness is not a soul, but is the brain and central nervous system, or perhaps certain portions of the body. Now, all I can ask of you in our time together is that you be willing to entertain new ideas about this, that undermine that claim, and the claim that the physical world is all that we know to exist. And so I'm going to do my best to lay out some considerations for you, and I hope that you'll find them stimulating and thought-provoking. And then we can have some time talking in the Q&A time, and I hope that will be helpful to you too. Now, I want to give one more preliminary or introductory remark, and this has to do with a fundamental law in metaphysics and philosophy that is sometimes just called the law of identity. Now, there are different laws of identity, but I'll just use the one that's so widely accepted. And the law of identity is very commonsensical, and it says basically that if something X is identical to something Y, they're actually the same thing, then everything that is true of X will be true of Y, and conversely. Now, what that means is that if you can find one thing that's true of X that is not true of Y, or even possibly true of X, but is not even possibly true of Y, then you have demonstrated that X and Y are actually two different things and not the same thing. So if aspirin is identical to acetylsalicylic acid, then everything true of aspirin will be true of acetylsalicylic acid, and conversely. And so the law of identity needs to be kept in mind as we go forward, because I want to ask two distinctively ontological questions. That is, questions that have to do with the reality and the nature of consciousness on the one hand, and of the reality and nature of whatever it is that has consciousness. So we'll start by talking about consciousness, and then we will go to what is the possessor of consciousness. And I'm going to be making a case that consciousness is not physical, and that it is the soul or the self or the I that possesses consciousness. So let's begin with the idea that consciousness is not physical. Now let's start with just a simple what's called an ostensive definition of consciousness. That would be defining consciousness by just pointing to an example of it. And shortly, I'll give you some characteristics of consciousness. But imagine that you've been in surgery and the anesthesiologist put you all the way under. You were out. But without knowing it, you're still unconscious and in the recovery room. And suddenly you began, your eyes have bandages over them, but you began to feel a throb in your knee. And you have a thought, and the thought is, I think I'm at home right now, but honestly, I'm not sure, but I think I am. And then you form a belief, and the belief is, oh wait, I actually believe I just finished having surgery. So while that's going on, you feel a thirst. You get thirsty. And that helps to create a desire to get a drink of water. And as a result of that, you exercise your choice, your free will, and you say, hey, if anybody's in the room and can hear my voice, would you mind bringing me something to drink? I'm really thirsty. Now, what is happening to you is that you're regaining consciousness. If you want to know what consciousness is, it is something like that. And I would just point to it as an ostensive definition. That is an example of consciousness. Now, can we get a little bit more rigorous about this? And the answer is yes. And what I'm going to do now is I want to list some features that appear to be true of consciousness that are not true of anything physical. And so I'll be making the argument that conscious states have features that are not the features of brain states or nervous system states, and so they cannot be the same thing. Now, before I do that, just keep in mind, just as water can be in 3 states, Texas, Arizona, and not Colorado, but I wouldn't count Colorado. We're running out of water out here. No, really, water could be in the state of solid, liquid, and gas. And similarly, consciousness can exist in at least 5 states. There are sensations, like a feeling of pain or a taste of a lemon. There are thoughts, like my thought that snow is white, And I could express the thought by saying snow is white or Schnee ist weiß. Those are two totally different sentences, but they express the same thought that's inside my mind. We have beliefs. These are propositional contents or meanings or semantic contents that we take to be true to some degree or other. You might not be sure about it, but maybe we're 60-40, but it is a belief that we hold. A desire is a felt inclination towards or away from something, maybe a desire for ice cream and to stay away from the dentist. And then finally, we have acts of free will where we exercise our volitional power and choose to do things. Now, I claim that these 5 states of consciousness are not the same thing as physical states in any sense of the word, nor are they physical states of the brain, because there are things true of them, not true of any physical state, especially a brain state, and conversely. For example, for every conscious state you have, there is what is called what it is like to be in that state. Philosophers call this a phenomenological quale or texture to the state. So, for example, there is a unique what it's like to be in a specific type of pain. There is a different what it's like to taste strawberry ice cream. There's a different what it's like to desire something to eat. There's a different what it's like to be me. There's actually a what it's like to be me as an individual and you as an individual. Now, the problem is that there's no what it's like to any brain state or even any physical state. I mean, you'll search in vain in any physics or chemistry or neuroscience text when they're describing all the different states of physics or chemistry or of the brain, different neuronic states and their firings and so on. You will search in vain for any attribute of being what it is like ascribed to a neuron or anything else. There is no what it is like to being negatively charged. There is no what it's like to being a calcium ion moving down toward a synapse. There's no what it's like to being an axon or a dendrite or a neuron or a set of neurons. And there is no what it's like to be a brain. And so mental states have this, but brain states don't. Also, there's a feature called intentionality, and the vast majority, if not all, mental states or conscious states have this. And this is a very simple idea. This is ofness or aboutness towards an object. It's directedness towards an object. For example, I may have a sensation of a lamp. I might have a thought about London. I could have a belief about New York City. I could have a desire for or of or about ice cream, and so on. And so when we take a look at these conscious states, they have this feature that they're always of or about some object of thought or belief or sensation. But no brain state is of or about anything. Again, neuroscientists do not attribute the property of intentionality to when they give an exhaustive description of synapses and axons and dendrites and neurons and all the rest. They never do leave third person physical language in giving an exhaustive description of brain states and the brain and so forth. And so mental states have intentionality, but brain states don't. Furthermore, many mental states have what are called semantic meanings or propositional content. Things like thoughts and beliefs and desires have a semantic meaning embedded within them. If I have a thought, that thought has a content, and we call that a propositional content or a meaning that can be expressed in a declarative sentence. And I use the example of having the thought that snow is white and then trying to select what sentence I would like to use to express that thought. Schnee ist weiß. The sentence is out there in the world. It's a sound or perhaps a scribbling on a sheet of paper. But the content of my thought is inside me, and it's called a semantic meaning. But no brain state has semantic meanings or propositional content in them. Mental states, many of them have alethic properties. That means they can have the property of being true or false, but it's hard to know what it would even mean to say that a specific brain state was true or this other brain state next to it, unfortunately, is false. These don't appear to be the sorts of things that would have alethic properties. Again, most mental states lack geometrical size and shape. My thought that 2 and 2 is 4 is not closer to my left ear, whereas my thought that dinner was good today is a little bit closer to my right ear. The two hemispheres do house different enabling brain functions that allow and cause and facilitate certain conscious states. But the conscious states of thought and so on are not in the brain. They don't have location or size or shape at all, it doesn't seem. It doesn't make any sense to ask, what is the shape of my thought that 2 and 2 is 4? But the brain state that's going on while I'm having that thought does have a size, a shape, and a specific location. You can actually look at it on a computer screen. If you have the brain plugged up to an EEG so that you're measuring electrical activity or oxygen flow. So that mental states don't have these features, but brain states do, so they can't be the same thing. Mental states or my conscious states are things to which I have private access. Let me explain. My conscious states have a certain nature to them. Namely, that I alone have direct access to what is going on inside my mind right now. You don't have direct access to my conscious life. You have to infer what I'm thinking by my verbal reports or my body language. If I get stuck with a pin and shout out, you could infer, well, he's in pain. You'd probably be right. But I don't have to infer that I'm in pain. I'm directly aware of it in a way that's not available to you. So we all have what is private access to our consciousness, and that tells us something about what consciousness is. It's the kind of thing that the subject that has it has a certain way of attending to it that others can't. Now, here's what's interesting about that. No physical state at all of any kind is privately accessible. All physical states are publicly accessible. It doesn't matter if it's the temperature of a statue or the hard state of an ice cube or a state of my brain. All of these, we all have equal access to them by doing the same things, by measuring them, putting a meter on them, or measuring the waves. And so brain states are not the kinds of things that are privately accessible. They're the sorts of things that are publicly accessible, but mental conscious states are privately accessible, and that tells us a little bit about what they are. Now, finally, conscious states seem to always entail a subject of consciousness that owns them. For example, we don't have ownerless sensations of pain floating around. Thoughts just don't drift off on their own. They always belong to someone. A thought is always someone's thought. A pain is always a subject's pain that has that pain. And so mental conscious states appear to entail, in a strong sense, a subject who possesses or has that conscious state. But no brain state entails any subject at all. In fact, many neuroscientists, if not the most of neuroscientists, don't believe there is a self. They don't believe there is an I or an ego or a self of any kind. So consequently, there would be no subject on that view that possesses a thought or a pain. And so these are reasons why I believe that consciousness cannot be physical. It has to be immaterial, because it has a whole range of features that are true of it that are not true of any physical state whatsoever, including states of the brain. Now, those would be my quick reasons for why I think consciousness is not physical. Now I want to move to the question, and I recognize this is brief, but I want to leave time for discussion. I want to move to the question of the soul, or the self, or the ego, or the I, or the mind. I'm not going to, the spirit, I don't care what word you use for it. I'll just stick with soul or self. And I want to know, is there such a thing? And why would anybody believe there is? Well, first of all, let's give a good historic definition of what a soul is. If you want more on this, the first book in your bibliography is a brief history of the soul, and it traces the concept of the soul from pre-Socratic, pre-Greek philosophy days all the way to the present. If we were to look at that history, as I have, then we could define a soul as something like this. It is an immaterial, or we might say spiritual or conscious substance or thing that has and unifies consciousness and animates the body. And so it is the soul that is supposed, by definition, supposedly is a sort of thing that possesses and unifies consciousness and that animates the body and makes it living instead of a corpse. Now, is there such a thing as the soul, and how would we find out? Well, in letter B, I want to make the point that neuroscience is really irrelevant to this question. About a few years ago, I was invited to lecture at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, and I gave about an hour and 15-minute lecture with a 45-minute Q&A following to about 130 research biologists and neuroscientists. And I made the claim that neuroscience is wonderful when it comes to discovering very detailed causal correlations between a conscious state and a brain state, or dependency relations between the two. Certain states of the brain depend on what you're thinking about, and certain states of consciousness depend on what's happened in the brain. But when it comes to the ontological question of what is consciousness and what is the thing that owns it, neuroscientific discoveries are largely irrelevant because they don't really have anything to do with those questions. They are distinctively philosophical questions. Now, to illustrate this, let's talk first of all about empirically equivalent theories and the underdetermination of theory by data. Now, two or more empirically equivalent theories are consistent with all and only the empirical observations. What that means is, if you have a group of theories that are empirically equivalent, you cannot appeal to any observational datum to decide which is the best theory among the competitors, because they all imply exactly the same observational data. If you're going to adjudicate which one is the best one to hold, you'll have to do it on some non-empirical basis, perhaps simplicity or explanatory power or something of that sort. Now, so empirically equivalent theories are underdetermined by data. That is, the data do not point to just one of those. The data point to all of the empirically equivalent theories and don't determine any one of them out of the possibilities. Now, we have discovered that there is a certain group of neurons in the brain that are associated with feelings of empathy. Indeed, if your mirror neurons become significantly damaged, you are no longer able to feel empathy for another person. Now, how should we explain this? Well, I will give you now 3 empirically equivalent theories that equally explain what we've learned empirically. First is strict physicalism, and that would be the view that a feeling of empathy is identical to, it's just the same thing as the firings of a mirror neuron. And when the mirror neurons don't fire, you can't have a feeling of empathy because they're just the same thing. That's one explanation. A next explanation is called mere property dualism. And that's the view that the properties of consciousness and the states of consciousness are in no way physical. They're entirely immaterial, but they belong to and are contained in the brain. And so the reason that when your mirror neurons are damaged, you can't feel empathy is that in your brain, there is a causal dependency relationship between the working of your mirror neurons and feelings of empathy. So that if the necessary conditions for that feeling to take place are damaged, you can't have the feeling of empathy. It's just like if your eyes are poked out, you won't be able to see anything, but that doesn't prove that your sensations are in your eyeballs. All it proves is that your ability to see is dependent on your eyes working while you're in your body. Now, substance dualism is a different view altogether. It says that we have two properties, the firing of mirror neurons and being a feeling of empathy, and two possessors. The brain possesses the firing of mirror neurons. The soul possesses the feeling of empathy. And when the soul is in the body, the soul won't work if the body's damaged. Just like a driver in a car is strapped into the front seat and can't get out, his ability to move is limited by what the car can do. If something happens to the steering wheel so that it will only turn right and not left, then the driver won't be able to turn left. It can only turn right. But that doesn't prove the driver's the car. It is consistent with the data that the driver is embodied in or housed in the car. And so substance dualism would say that I am a soul and conscious properties are in my soul. The brain has physical properties in it, but there is a dependency relation both ways while we're embodied. Now, all three of these are empirically equivalent. What that means is the empirical discoveries of neuroscience really can't say anything about which of the three should be preferred. That has to be decided on philosophical grounds. Now, having said that, there are a whole handful of arguments. I'm working. I edited a collection with Blackwell called the Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism, and there were a whole host of arguments that were offered for there being a soul. But let me give you three, and then we can close and have a little time of discussion. First of all, I think it's self-evident that a person is the same from one moment to the next, and that I am the same self or same ego or same person that began this lecture 35 minutes ago. This becomes obvious, for example, if I'm reading a brief story in the newspaper or humming a tune. I'm aware of the fact that as I hum this tune, I am the one who continues to be the hummer. If I'm halfway through the tune, I am actually aware of that I had hummed the first few moments of the tune. I am currently humming a particular part of the tune, and I am anticipating finishing the tune in my humming shortly. And so I become aware that I continue to be literally the same self from one moment to the next as I walk through my day. By the way, if I weren't, then I think reasoning and deliberation would not be possible. Because if I have an example of what's called modus ponens, a simple logical law, if P then Q and P therefore Q, if there was one self that attended to the first premise, if P then Q, a totally different self attended to the second premise, P, and somebody else that attended to the conclusion, therefore Q, there would literally be no drawing of the conclusion by reasoning through the syllogism. The only way that can happen is if it's the same self that attends to the major premise, attends to the minor premise, holds them together and looks at what they entail, checks the conclusion and discovers, lo and behold, that is what the premises entail, and this is a correct argument. Now, the problem is that material objects don't literally stay the same, even though they undergo part replacement. If I had a podium and it was made out of wood, and I started replacing each little part of the podium with a part of frozen green Jell-O, and this took me days and days and days, but I eventually ended up with a podium that was made out of all and only frozen green Jell-O parts. And on the side, there was just a pile of wood chips that I had taken off the podium. I would have to say that is not the same podium. It's different because it's made out of different parts. I mean, if you had a stack of lumber in the backyard, 5 pieces of lumber piled on top of each other, if you took one piece of lumber and replaced it with another one, you don't have the same pile. It wouldn't matter if you nailed them together. If you unnailed one and put another one and nailed it on so that they were rigidly bonded and attached, you'd still have a different pile of lumber. And it wouldn't matter if you had 1,000 pieces of lumber piled up. If you took one off and put one new one on there, if we're speaking about the entire pile of lumber, you don't have the same pile. The problem then is that your body and your brain are undergoing part replacement and part change all the time. Even in your brain, the neurons that are in there are undergoing chemical changes where sometimes ions are floating off and others are being absorbed. And so if I were my body and brain, I would not be the same person from one moment to the next, but I am. And by the way, if I were not the same person, there would be no reason to fear the future, like going to the dentist, or to punish me for something I did a year ago, because I right now am not literally the same person who did that crime and who will go to the dentist. It will be a double or a lookalike that shares a handful of, or a lot of parts with me. So I believe that we know we're the same through part replacement, but our bodies and brains are not. So I cannot be my body and brain. And the most rival candidates are either I'm a body and brain or some immaterial self or I. And I believe that therefore I'm an immaterial I or self. Secondly, the argument from the mere possibility of disembodied existence. Now, if I had something, a pile of white powder and 2 piles of white, or a pile of white powder, and I called it aspirin and acetylsalicylic acid. But if there was something possibly true of one of the piles that was not even possibly true of the other, I would have to conclude that I was wrong in saying they were one pile to begin with. It actually would have to be 2 different piles because one has a possible truth and the other doesn't have that truth. Now, I am not arguing for life after death. But we all have heard near-death experience stories. We've watched Dateline NBC or 2020 and heard accounts of these things. And the vast majority of people who watch these will say the following: look, I don't believe these are real, but I will tell you I'm willing to hear a case for them, and I'll let the evidence decide. If the evidence is persuasive to me, I'll believe in them. If not, I'll be skeptical. But I'm willing to hear a case on it. Now, suppose that they had a show on TV that was about the discovery of square circles in the state of Montana. They were going to the evidence for and against that. Well, nobody's going to watch a show like that because I don't need evidence to decide whether that happened. Why? Because that is not even metaphysically possible. It is a logical contradiction. Now, when people are willing to allow evidence to decide whether these near-death experiences are true or not, they are admitting that they are at least possibly true. That is to say, they're admitting that it's certainly possible that a human person could survive without their body. It's probably not true, or maybe it is. I don't know, but I admit to you that it could be the case. Let's let the evidence tell us what we should believe. But by admitting it could be the case, they're admitting that they're souls and not bodies and brains. Why? Because the body and brain is such that it is not even possible for a body and brain to exist disembodied. I don't know what a disembodied body would even mean, or an immaterial chunk of matter would mean. And so the fact that we're possibly disembodiable, but our brains and bodies aren't, shows that I cannot be anything physical because I could exist without anything physical existing. Finally, I'll say that I think we all know that occasionally we exercise what I call common sense free will. Maybe I choose to vote, and I could have refrained and gone home, but I just freely chose to raise my hand and vote, or I might choose to do something later this evening. And so many times we do exercise free will, and we're morally responsible because we do so. If I didn't have freedom of the will and all my actions were controlled by factors outside of my control, I don't believe I would have any responsibility because I never did anything. I was simply a vehicle through which causal chains ran, and I didn't have an ability to do otherwise. Well, now, if I'm a material object, my brain and nervous system, then all of my behavior is determined in two ways. First, through time. The universe at time t plus the laws of nature determine or fix the probabilities of what is going to happen at a subsequent time t prime. That means that I am either, if I am a material object, no matter how complex, my behavior is determined, or at least the chances or the probabilities are fixed of what I'll do next through time. Now, synchronically, at a point in time, the behavior of macro objects, it is arguably the case, is determined by the microphysical parts that compose them. Whatever happens at the level of microphysics is what brings about what happens at the macro level. And consequently, if I were a brain and a body, which is a macro ordinary sized object, whatever that body and brain does would be determined by the ultimate microphysical parts I have. But I know that I have free will, at least occasionally. Therefore, I can't be subject to the laws of nature in a deterministic way, or my parts. I must be able to transcend those laws, and that means I must be something that is non-physical in order to be able to exercise free will. The most available candidate for that would be a self or a soul or something like that. Now, I want to close by saying this has been like taking a drink out of a fire hydrant. I know it's been fast. But I do hope at least you realize that whether or not consciousness is physical and whether there's a soul is not simply, maybe not even a scientific question, that there are philosophical issues that do weigh in on this issue. Thank you so much.
Just a second, we'll try to get Robert on.
Okay. Dr. Garcia, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Nice to see you, sir.
You too, JP. Thank you so much for the talk, and lots of good information, lots of things to think about. And I'm just happy to be here to ask you some questions and push you on a few things. Sort of a random list of questions that I have.
Good.
So substance dualism, if you've ever heard of substance dualism, you've heard of the standard objection to it. And as you know, it's just a causal interaction problem. And so I thought let me set the problem up for you and then see what you have to say about it. So you've noted several features that seem to be true about consciousness that are not true about physical states. You have quite a long list. And it seems to me that the stronger the case is for the difference between consciousness and physical states, the more difficult it is to see how they could causally interact, right? So the case for dualism often has the feel of, look how different these things are. Consciousness has this and this and this and this, and physical states couldn't possibly have this. And so they look more and more dissimilar, which makes it harder to understand how they could come into some sort of causal traction. And so you have the causal interaction problem, which is the question of how is it that an immaterial soul could causally interact with something so radically different as a brain. So that's part of the problem is a causal interaction. And then there's a related problem that I'll follow up with, which has to do with not the causal relationship, but the pairing relationship. And I'll say what that is in a moment. But
okay,
talk to us about the causal interaction problem.
This is a great question, Robert, and I really appreciate you asking it. I'm discerning two very different questions in this, so let me tease them out. The first question that is expressed by saying, how could consciousness and the soul interact with something physical, could be a mere expression of skeptical doubt. I'm very skeptical that this could happen. And why am I skeptical? Well, because these things are so different. And it doesn't make any sense to me that things that are so different could have a causal interaction with one another. And I think I would say two things in response to that. And the first one is that I think we have far more evidence from our own awareness that when I get stuck with a pin, it causes a feeling of pain. And when I choose to raise my arm, that it actually goes up. I think we have more evidence of that type, that there is causal interaction, than I have for believing that two things can interact with each other only if they're relevantly similar. So I think the first thing I might say is I might call into question the relative strengths of my direct awareness that this interaction takes place all the time. If I didn't think that, I'd probably stop willing to move my body to do things because I would give up on it making a difference. The other thing, and I don't know that I've got much reason to believe the principle that two things can interact only if they're pretty much alike one another. So now that's my first response, the relative weights of those positions. The second one is that I think that the principle that only things that are relevantly similar can causally interact has been not been a part of the history of science or philosophy. There have been so many examples of where science has held to theories where you have one entity like a field or a force interacting with a particle, or something like a wave interacting with a particle. And these are radically different entities. You have quantum waves that, by collapsing, in some way bring about, maybe we even use causal language there, cause to come about a specifically located, say, material object. Well, a quantum wave is not anything like a desk or a photon or anything else. And so what I want to suggest, Robert, is that in the history of philosophy, science, even discarded theories like phlogiston, which was an odd entity, it had negative weight and so on, but nobody had any difficulty believing that phlogiston could interact with ordinary matter. Turned out that theory was false, but that was so for empirical reasons, not because there was an incoherence in the very idea. I would say one more thing. I don't think even atheists have any problem with the idea that if there's a God, he could have parted the Red Sea. They may not believe in a God, but they would grant that if there is one, surely he could have parted the Red Sea. And I think that shows that God, who is, if there is one, is a purely spiritual being, there's no problem with that utterly spiritual being interfering in the matter and parting the Red Sea, even if we don't know how it happens. So that's the first thing. Now, I'll try to be not as long-winded here. The second way to understand the question, well, how could these two interact with one another, is the request for a mechanism that causally connects the two things together. So if I say, how does turning my ignition cause the spark plugs to fire in my car? I'm not expressing a sense of how in the world could this possibly be the case? They're so different. No, what I'm asking you is to describe an intervening mechanism that takes place between the turning of my ignition and the sparking of the plugs. And if you describe that, you've answered the question. Now, if the question is, well, by way of what kind of a mechanism could a mental thing operate on a physical thing, or conversely? I think the answer is that there is no mechanism, because the causal interaction is basic and primitive. Now, let me explain. If A can interact with B only by way of an intervening mechanism C, then we can ask, well, how can A interact with C? And if the answer is only by an intervening mechanism D, then I think we generate a regress that is vicious, because the thing we're trying to analyze away always shows up again in the new analysis. So we just kick the can down the street, we might say. At some point, you have to say, well, the way A interacts with X is it just does. It's just a basic interaction without being done by way of an intermediary. So those would be some very quick answers to that, but there's a lot more going on, and you take it however you want to now.
Thank you, JP. Yes. So just to summarize what I heard you say, and then I'll move on to the different way to approach it. So on the, if you ask the question, well, how do they interact? You could understand that as skepticism about the possibility of it. And your response was, well, there seems to be a principle being assumed that for two things to causally interact, they have to be similar in certain ways. And you wanted to reject that principle as a general principle, and say, look, it's possible for there to be causal interaction between things that don't have any real apparent similarity. And there are cases of that just in ordinary physics. Okay. And then the other way to read the question is as a request for a mechanism. What's the mechanism that intervenes between the soul and the brain? What are the gears in between? And you're saying, well, if you want a mechanism, you need a mechanism between the mechanism and the soul, for example. So you end up on a regress. So it's reasonable to take it to be primitive that certain things can causally interact without an intervening mechanism. Otherwise, we have a regress. Does that sound right?
Well, I wish I'd have put it that way. You should have answered the question.
I'm just
great. I loved it.
Okay, so here's a different kind of problem concerning the relationship between the soul and the brain on dualism, and it's sometimes called the pairing problem, but we can call it the too many souls problem if we want. And there's the fancy words here. There's a diachronic version and a synchronic version of the problem. And so let me explain. So diachronic means sort of across time. And so let's consider a person named Diane. So remind you of the diachronic case. And Diane suffers brain trauma of a momentous sort. And before and after the brain trauma, she displays a very different kind of personality, right? So these are not unheard of cases where somebody gets severe trauma and the person that wakes up from the coma is very different, right, from the person that went into the coma. So that's the first case. And then the synchronic case, we'll consider a guy named Sid. And Sid has multiple personality disorder. Right. So the question is, if you're a substance dualist, on what grounds can you hold that in the Diane case that there's just one soul, right? As opposed to there being a new soul after the severe trauma, right? What's to prohibit the first soul being detached by the trauma and a new soul coming into place? After all, it looks like a very different person. And in the synchronic case, or the case with Sid, on what grounds could a dualist hold that there's only one soul that's manifesting in multiple personalities, rather than saying there's multiple souls who take turns embodying the same brain? So.
Okay, these are good questions. Let's take the diachronic case first. And I think the thing I would do would be starting off by asking, well, why do I think that I have one soul in the first place? And I think it's because of something called the unity of consciousness problem. And basically, I'll give you a light touch on this, but we find that our consciousness is not a collection of atomistic little pieces of mental entities, like a little sensation and a little thought, that are somehow atomistically part priority, part the whole, kind of put together and bonded. Instead, we find that consciousness is somehow holistic. That is to say, that the different aspects of my consciousness all belong to the very same conscious field, so that suppose I'm looking at two horses that are walking next to one another, and there is a what it's like to see the brown horse, there is a what it's like to see the white horse, but there's also a what it is like to see the brown and white horse taken together. Mm-hmm. And that is what it's like, that is the holistic aspect of consciousness of that particular sort. And I want to suggest that there has to be some explanation for why the soul, or why consciousness contains what are called internal relations and are unified like that, because it can't be explained by an aggregate object, an object that is a mere collection of parts. And the reason it can't is because whenever an object that is a collection of parts functions like a computer, it does so by assigning different functions to different parts of the object. And the function of the whole is just reducible down to the sum of the functions of each of the parts. We've actually discovered that that's what the brain really does. Because when I look at, let's say, a chest of drawers, there's one region of the brain that registers a wavelength activity that corresponds to the shape, another the size, another the color, another the distance, another whether it's in motion or at rest. So the brain breaks it down like we would expect it to do, since it's composed of myriads of parts. And the question then becomes, what is it that brings them together into a unity? And I believe very quickly the answer would be some kind of a spiritual partless substance that is not an aggregate of parts, but that is simple in that it doesn't have what I call separable parts. It's not an aggregate. Now, I think that I am aware of my simple self. I think I'm just not only aware of my conscious states, but I'm aware of me as the owner of them. And I don't discover another thinker here or another sentient being. There's just one of me. All right. Now, I have undergone in my life a whole host of various physical traumatic events. I've been knocked unconscious. I've had several operations and this, that, and the other. And except for going under and being unconscious, these physical things that occurred to me didn't, I was still the same self, and I was aware of being the same self, though I was damaged. And I couldn't function as well as I could because my brain didn't work. Now, those were cases where I was conscious throughout the damage to my brain and other things that happened to me. I then would project that even in cases where I undergo some sort of an event where I go through unconscious, it would be likely that that's just not the sort of thing that could pop something out of existence and pop a new person into existence, because this is just this is a little bit more severe in the same kind of event that I know doesn't take me out and bring in a new person. The other thing I would say would be, I think it's the simplest explanation for why the subsequent person continues to have pretty much the same body and pretty much a lot of the same memories and personality traits, though a lot of them are different. And I think the simpler explanation is to explain that is there was damage to their personality, not a replacement of their self. I think that's a much more metaphysically extravagant claim, and it would require extra justification. So that would be my take on that. Now, the multiple personality case is really interesting because what they've discovered is that in multiple personality cases, there is always what you might call a background self that is aware of having all the other selves and sort of is the unifier of them. Although that one doesn't speak up very often, but there is one of these selves that knows that these other ones they belong to this. And the goal of therapy and so on is to get these to integrate back into that self and to find ways for them to reintegrate. Now, so what I think happens in this reintegration is not that a self goes out of existence, but that a dysfunctional part of us that isn't, we're not aware of what's happening there, becomes into unified awareness with what was already there. So in multiple personality cases, I think that while I'm in the body, if the brain is something happens to my brain, my consciousness doesn't work well. It doesn't work like normal, and it can literally become fragmented. I mean, Jesus said, don't let the left hand know what the right hand's doing. And I think there are actually times when we can be unaware. I know people who've had sexual abuse who are experiencing another case of abuse can not feel anything in their body. So they're unaware that their body is being touched or what have you. I'm sorry if this offends anybody, but they're able to split off is what I'm suggesting. And I think what happens in those cases synchronically is that the functioning of the brain causes pockets of kind of unified consciousness in some weak sense around a personality that is not in touch with another part because the brain isn't allowing that to occur. But I do think eventually with therapy, these can be reabsorbed into, so I would attribute it to personalities splitting up rather than a self splitting up.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for those questions.
Yeah, that was really helpful and detailed. My general impression is that that there's plenty of material for the dualist to use to come up with an explanation, empirical findings, especially about multiple personality disorder and so on. I guess I wonder if you think that the problems that I've mentioned are no worse for the dualist than they are for a physicalist about the mind. Can you give a quick response to that?
Well, I think I'm not sure what you're thinking about, so I'm going to ask you to comment, but I'll give you a quick. I think, like I've already argued in the lecture, maybe we have a problem with the fragmentation of the self, but they have the problem with the unity of the self. And I think that the diachronic sameness of a person over time is a legitimate problem. I mean, if I'm my brain, there is a syndrome called Dandy Walker syndrome, where these children are born and grow to adulthood. Robert, they have 10% of a brain. I've seen an X-ray, and there is a centimeter thick sheath of brain tissue around the inside, around the skull, and inside the skull is a pocket of fluid. But they are like 70 or 80% functional. They have lives and they can get married, and they're about 80% functional. That's more than I can say for most of the freshmen at Biola during finals week, but in any case. Okay. You know what I mean there. And I mean, that you've got a whole person, but you don't have a whole brain. And so I'd like to know how a physicalist explains that. I mean, and I would say the same thing for the multiple personality issue. By the way, there is a problem of too many thinkers for the physicalist, because you ask, why do we think the brain matters? Why should I say on my brain? Well, because the brain seems to be the thing that is directly responsible for consciousness in some sense. Well, the problem is that if you're going to go that route, then you're going to have to end up with there being 6 or 7 different cells, because there is a region of the brain that is directly responsible for visual sensations, another with auditory, and another with taste and smell and thinking. So why say I'm one self instead of breaking me down into a different self for a different subsystem? And so I'd like, that's going to be a problem for them as well.
I see. So let me ask, this will be my last question, and it's a very general question. So consider a view, let's call it agnosticism about the mind. And if you're an agnostic of this sort, you think, look, we don't know enough about the brain or anything to rule out a physicalist view of the mind. And we're justified, they say, in suspending judgment about the matter, right? So they withhold their, imagine a physicalist who says, we don't know, right? We don't affirm, we don't deny substance dualism, right? So maybe there'd be a special kind of physicalist, if you will. But imagine somebody who's agnostic, at least about this topic. And perhaps they say something like, in addition, they say, look, this might be their motivation. Look at the record of science, like fantastic track record. We used to know so little compared to what we know now, and as time goes by, we're able to explain more and more things that looked previously like they were inexplicable. So maybe we have grounds for holding out hope that we can come up with a physicalistic understanding of the mind, but we suspend judgment, right? And so I'm considering a view like this. And so before I ask you the question, just as a reminder, this agnostic might say, and JP, remember when you're responding to the interaction problem, one of your responses has the effect of, look, we can know that they interact without knowing how they interact. So the fact that we don't know how is not a reason to infer that they don't. So she says, thanks for that strategy. I'm going to deploy it on my behalf. The fact that we don't know how the physical world is or gives rise to the mental doesn't mean that it doesn't. And so we'll use the same argument, right? So then the question is, noting that in addition, neither view can free itself entirely of mystery, if you will, or primitives. Then the question is, so why is substance dualism more reasonable than the agnostic view, right? Why should that be the preferred view?
The really good question. And I think my answer would be because there is a disanalogy in the two cases. The case of believing that consciousness and the soul are real and not physical, and that interaction is basic, compared to questions that I might have a view on, but that further scientific research could show what the answer to that was, and I could be wrong. Like the Martian probe landed today, and I don't think there's life on Mars, but they could find out that there is, and I'd have to admit that. So now what I want to try to show is that there's a disanalogy in these cases. And the first way to see that is we have to draw a careful distinction between an ontological question about what something is versus an epistemological or explanatory question as to how it came about or what gave rise to it. Now, my talk has not had anything to do with whether consciousness and the soul emerge from matter when it reaches a suitable level of complexity. That is not my view, but that I am begging off on that. So if you ask, and you can ask the question, well, why did you have that thought right then? And I might say, shoot, I don't know. I mean, my brain might have caused it, or a memory might have caused it, or a fear, or maybe I freely caused myself to think about that instead of thinking about what I don't know. It could be any of the above. So I still know that the thought is there and that it's not physical. Now, I'm proving that now, but I would want to draw a distinction there. So I am not in principle at this point against the idea that science may discover that consciousness and conscious selves can emerge from suitably complex matter at a certain stage of development. What I'm concerned about is the ontological question of what are these things. Now, if you take a look at the history of science, which I and I'm sure you've done this too, and I've studied it myself. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on it, but I've studied enough to know my way around it. What you have found is that it is a history of usually replacing entities with other entities that are more or less alike like those, with some exceptions. There are exceptions to that. And that would be cases with fields and forces, for example. Those are different than particles. But what you do have is kind of a continuity of finding, I don't know, I guess you could just call them material causal entities, so that, as a number of what I call scientific naturalists claim, that the history of science hasn't really, especially since the scientific revolution in the 17th century, hasn't been really jerky. It's been more accumulative with some jumps, and I'm giving it more of a realist read now. And what we have discovered is that there seems to be some kind of a convergence on efficient and material causes. And so it looks like we're taking apples and we're usually replacing them with a refined view of the apple rather than jumping to bananas or something like that, with admittedly some exceptions. What I would say, though, is that the claim that science has made all this progress has usually been fine-tuning the apples or finding out that there may be other fruit that's out there, but they're maybe like apples in that they're fruit. I think the questions about the self and the soul and consciousness are comparing apples with aardvarks. I mean, these are so radically different that when I take a look at what scientific method has done for the last, since the 1800s up until now, from kind of rigid enumerative induction to a whole range of methods now, what I discover is that the methodologies that are used, especially in the hard sciences, just aren't amenable to the kinds of questions that you need to answer to get at the ontological issues. So I'm making the claim that if you examine this carefully, Robert, you will discover that the questions I've argued tonight are more distinctively philosophical and ontological. They're not scientific. And you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. But I think if you look at the types of questions that are being asked, you can see that they belong to different disciplines, whereas the scientific progress were questions about things that were still within that same general bailiwick. So that would be an attempt to try to answer that.
Great, thank you for that. That's helpful. I'm now going to stop asking my own questions and move to Slido. And the first question on Slido is about somebody getting a lobotomy, but that's very similar to the question I asked before. So I'm going to skip that one. And then okay, the slide's changing. Here's the next question. And I'll just read it and then I'll just let you interpret it. Does your reasoning apply to animal souls? Is there any way to know about animals' conscious experience?
Yes, in fact, it does. And I'm going to recommend a book that would be in your library. It's called Evolution of the Soul by Richard Swinburne. Swinburne is a retired Oxford philosophy professor. And he has 2 or 3 chapters in his book, Evolution of the Soul, where he argues about the existence of animal souls and how we would know what kind of a soul an animal has. And I find his general line of approach to be a reasonable one. This is involved in kind of your general views of epistemology, but I tend to side with his what's called internalism. But the point is that this problem of animal souls is a problem of the general problem called other minds. How do I know that you have a mind and you another human being? And how do I know what kind of a mind do you have? Do you have thoughts or do you just have sensations? Do you have emotions? Do you have beliefs? Can you think about your thinking? So the kind of the quick answer is that you attribute to an animal only those mental states needed to explain its behavior and nothing more and nothing less. You use the principle of simplicity to attribute to them what is the most reasonable explanation of their behavioral outputs given certain inputs. And the more analogous another organism is to us, the more confident, I think, are our grounds of judging the type of mental state they have. And so I would say that animals have souls because they're conscious and their bodies are enlivened. And they don't all have the same kind, though. Some animals have a compartment that is capable of thinking and having beliefs, whereas I'm not so sure that frogs do that. I would rather think that they have sensations and hereditary ingrained reactions to those sensations. But you attribute the simplest view, and I would say that's how you know. But Swinburne is the place to go on that.
Would you, just a follow-up, would you say that animal souls, that there are any animal souls besides human animals, where those souls have agency or free will?
That's a really tough one. And those who argue that animals have libertarian free will draw a distinction between the libertarianism of spontaneity or the free will of spontaneity and the free will of intentional agency. And the free will of spontaneity is the power to choose and not be determined to make that choice. And it's just the power to choose something. But it is not done in light of a teleological intention or goal for the sake of which you're striving. Now, some argue that. I am inclined to think, based on simplicity, that animals are likely not to have free will because I think I can explain their behavior by attributing to them beliefs and desires, and their actions are determined by their belief desire sets. They desire food and believe that that thing over there will satisfy that desire, and that determines their movement. And to attribute free will is to go a little bit beyond. It's not as simple, and so I think I'd probably stick with the simpler explanation. I won't do that with you because I think I'm aware of my own free will, and we're so analogous. But you know, they're compatibilists there, and you may be one of them. I don't. That's my view.
Okay, yeah, that's
And I'm sticking with it.
The next question, are there properties that are housed in the body that are not housed in the soul? In particular, is sex in the body, but gender in the soul?
Well, this is very, very tough, and I'll tell you why. I think the first thing you have to do is to try to get clear on what is a body. And, there are different views on this. I think most physicalists, of course, and even what are called Cartesian dualists who follow Descartes, would say the body is purely a physical structure of some kind. I, on the other hand, hold to a certain specific version of what is called staunch hylomorphism or Aristotelian Thomistic dualism of a certain kind. And that means that for me, a body is not just matter, but it's ensouled matter. And so part of the body is soulishness. So if the soul leaves the body, then you don't have a body any longer, you have a corpse. So a corpse is purely physical, but a body is a physical soulish structure. And then there could be all sorts of things in the body, but that would be because the body is also including the soulish informing of the body. Now, if just a strictly physical body, my own view is that the body is a manifestation of the nature of the soul. So if I am, my gender is male, that will manifest itself into male. If I'm female, that will manifest itself in female body parts. Admittedly, there are what you might call borderline cases. And even Aristotle recognized that even though there were kinds of things, there were borderline cases that made it tough to know how to classify them. I fully acknowledge that. But that doesn't mean that 99.9% of the cases, you have a clearly male or female body. If you have a male body, then that is a gendered male. If they don't feel male, then this is my view, then I believe that they need loving help to learn what happened and to try to come in line with who they really are. I actually think it does somebody no good to tell them what they want to hear. And sometimes love has to be tough and says, look, you won't flourish long haul if you don't try to follow what the truth is here. And I want you to give it a try, not because I'm mad at you, but because I want you to flourish. And I think by trying to surround yourself with people that tell yourself, that you're a woman in a man's body, I don't think that's true. I don't think it's going to help you long run. But that's my view.
Thank you for that clarification. My impression is that the answer you've given us is sort of an answer to an in-house debate among substance dualists. That is
absolutely
a very important question, but
no.
You could be a substance dualist and take any number of views about this
absolutely
question.
Right.
It's a very sensitive and important question, but
I totally agree.
Yeah, nothing. It's hard to see.
Right.
Yeah, there's not it's hard to see how there's an objection in the works from this type of question, though it's an important one.
Good point. Very good point, Robert.
So here's a question, and this might take us into some new territory. So how do we account for experiments that seem to support materialism? For example, the experiment that shows that the neurological response actually precedes a person's choice. So I think the person who wrote this question is thinking of those experiments that seem to show that the conscious experience of making a choice is actually preceded by certain things in the brain that happened that already set the choice in motion.
Well, these all go back to Benjamin Libet's experiments, and it's very famous because he measured that there was a buildup of an action potential as measured by EEGs on the scalp. I think it was a half a second or so before the person reported making the choice to act, like noting the clock hand was at a certain place. Now, even Libet admitted that even if there was still free won't, if not free will, he meant by that even after the action potential builds up, you're not determined to have to wiggle your finger. You still retain the veto power of not going along with the buildup of action potential on the brain. So that even he said that the action potential in no way it determines or supports a materialistic view. Secondly, I think that what the action potential is measuring is not the moment of choosing, but either the buildup of anticipation of being about to choose, which would of course precede the choice, or the forming of an intention to choose, which is not the same thing as then acting on that intention. So I think that this is measuring mental events that actually occur before the time of choice. I think the next thing I would say, and then the final one is going to be, to me, the big deal. The next point I would say would be, I think there might even be a time lag in the reporting. So for example, suppose that the action potential really did measure the moment of choosing. There might be a slight time lag before the person became aware of choosing and had the wherewithal to report it by wiggling their fingers. So perhaps the choice didn't come after the buildup, it was the reporting of the choice that did. Now here's my problem, and Richard Swinburne addresses this thoroughly in his book, Mind, Brain, and Free Will. And he says that when scientists do these experiments, they assume that what comes out of the patient's mouth or their body language, for example, I made the choice at that moment by wiggling their finger, that what comes out is the result of the following. First, a desire to tell the truth and a belief that by saying certain words or wiggling my finger, I will satisfy that desire and tell the truth, and then choosing to act on those desires. Going ahead and choosing to express the truth. If we don't assume that, if we assume that this proves materialism, then the sounds that come out of people's mouths are no more to be trusted than those that come out of a parrot. When a parrot says, well, welcome to the pet shop, they're expressing a cognitive propositional content. They have been programmed so that their brain responds through physical causal habituation to certain stimuli. What that means is that what comes out of the parrot's mouth is physically caused by non-rational factors. They're not the result of an intention and a desire to tell and express the truth and to use this means to do so, and choosing that. I don't trust the truth value of things that a parrot tells me. Here's your owner here, and he says the parrot makes a sound. I don't believe that. If I drove by on a hillside and it said, there was a scribble that said 10 10 kilometers to Wales, I found out that that was actually formed, no kidding, by erosion over many, many years. I would not believe for a minute that I should expect the town of Wales to occur in 10 kilometers. Why? Because that message, quote unquote, was the result of purely non-rational physical causes. Well, if you're going to say that these experiments show that physicalism is true in the first place, that undermines the very reason why you would trust the reports of these things to form your theories and to verify your theories in the first place. So I think it's self-defeating to say they verify physicalism.
Very interesting. I just want a follow-up question that might be interesting to hear your thoughts on. Supposing we do have, what philosophers call libertarian freedom, the ability to make choices that aren't caused by antecedent conditions and so on. I know you're a libertarian. How often do you think we exert our ability to make such choices? Or another way to put it is, many libertarians will say we have this capacity to make libertarianly free choices. But of course, it doesn't mean that all of our choices are libertarianly free. Only a subset of them. And some people wonder how small that subset is. And the smaller it is, the more interesting the implications are for ethics and virtue and character formation. So do you have any sense on how few of these choices we're capable of making and the significance of that?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think that we exercise libertarian free choice hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times a day. But here's where we do so. I believe that we exercise our fundamental place of exercising freedom is where we choose to direct our senses. Like if I come into a room, I might choose to notice something. Sometimes I'm triggered to notice something. Okay, no doubt about that. Or I'm in the habit of looking at the clock. So that's not a free choice at that moment. But a lot of times I look at different things and I kind of choose to poke around. I think also our freedom is most clearly evident as to what we choose to think about. And we know that I can tell the phenomenological difference between an active thought that I have chosen to ponder and a passive thought that I'm thinking about because I received something from someone else. There's a different texture. And I think we choose to think about various different things or to daydream all throughout the day, but not all the time. Some of them are triggered. When it comes to the most important choices, I think that probably at the moment we're not libertarianly free, because at some time in the past we made a choice to kind of make that our own and to make that a habit or to internalize that as a part. So I do think that back there was a choice that makes me responsible for this, even though right now I don't choose to act on it, but I choose to get to the place where it was habituated. So is that the result of a libertarian choice? Yes and no. No, not right now, but yeah, maybe 5 years ago when I first started thinking about this. So I think a lot of them aren't on the spot. Gosh, I'm glad, because I like to be able to put things on automatic pilot and not have to be choosing all the time. It's just, it actually makes life a lot easier.
Interesting. Do you, when it comes to character formation and habits, virtue and vices, where are those habits? Where do they reside, do you think? In the body or in the soul?
Yeah, I think they reside in the body. And I like to say, take a CD. Does it have sound in it? No. How do I know? I've held it up to my ears and I can't hear anything. What it has in it are grooves, let's say, or magnetized or digitalized structure. And if you put that in the right retrieval system and it isn't damaged, it will produce music or a sound in the room. Now, similarly, I don't think anxiety resides in my brain, but I do believe that there are neurological grooves in my brain that are completely describable in third-person neuroscientific language that have been habituated that will trigger an anxious episode without me choosing it. And so that those habitual grooves are actually in the body. And that's why Paul tells us in Romans 6 to present the members of our body to God as instruments of righteousness and well-being. And by presenting, he means adopt a set of habituating practices that you do over and over again until you form peace-inducing, fruit of the spirit-inducing habits and get rid of the anxiety and the depression. I wrote a book on anxiety called Finding Quiet, where I actually talk about the importance of bodily dispositions in getting rid of depression and anxiety. So that something has practical benefit.
So then would a disembodied soul be lacking in virtue and vice because they're lacking in character? Because the character is embodied in the body?
No, I don't. Well, I think what's embodied, what is in the body are habituated grooves that trigger character in the soul. So I think that a disembodied soul would still have character, but they wouldn't have the normal way of those being triggered. And so I think that it's possible that those powers, I think when people describe their near-death experiences, and there are so many of these, I believe these are true. The best book on it is by John Burke, Imagine Heaven. And when people report what it was like, it's very clear that they retain powers to do different things. They're not all the time exercising. So we still have dispositional powers. It's just that they're not triggered or stored in grooves in the body. So I don't think that the virtues are in the body. I think the grooves that habituate them are. But I do think we still have power, the ability to retain a disposition as a disposition and not actualize it.
Okay. Yeah, that's a tricky issue.
That is tricky.
I should get back to the script here. Okay. So this question says, I'm heavily swayed by Dennis Dutton's talk, consciousness is an illusion that stands against dualism. If you've seen it, what are your thoughts on his views? And before you answer, if it's the same question about the free will that you've already covered, then we can just move on. I haven't seen this talk, so I don't know what it's about.
Well, I haven't seen the talk either, but let me make some comments that might be helpful. Consciousness can't be an illusion because an illusion is itself a state of consciousness. A typical illusion might be when you're looking at the desert and you see water on the highway, but it's not there. That's an illusion. That is an appearance that is still in a conscious state. You're having an appearing of water, even though there's no object that it corresponds to. So illusions are themselves states of consciousness. So I don't know how consciousness could be an illusion, because that just means that there's still consciousness in order to have illusion. Secondly, there is, if he really means consciousness is an illusion, that means that all of his own states are illusory. I hope he'd apply that to himself. And so I'd kind of like to know what would it mean for him for something to be real? What is the difference between reality and illusion for him? Even though he grants that nothing's real, what would it be to be real? And then I'd like to know why he thinks certain things don't satisfy that criterion that he's offered, and why we ought to believe his own analysis, because he's admitting that his views don't latch on to reality. And he appears to be trying to make some kind of a claim about the actual nature of our conscious states, namely that conscious states are of such a nature as to be illusions. And I don't know, I just sort of wonder, how was he able to get to that and to report that? So
Yeah, thank you. I agree. It's not clear what it would mean to say that consciousness is an illusion. Maybe the self is an illusion. That would be a different claim.
Yes.
Okay, this is gonna be the last question, and I'm gonna construct a question sort of from some of the comments here. So one person says, as a stage 4 cancer patient, I wonder, will the soul continue after death? Or are the soul and brain simultaneous, such that if the brain dies, the soul also dies? So perhaps you can finish this talk by addressing this question and telling us why your view provides us with some hope for life after death.
Well, right. My view is that the soul is different than the physical body, and that while I'm in the body, the brain depends on the mind, and the mind depends on the brain, and so there's a dependency. But if I were able to get out of the body, then the dependency would no longer exist. And not only did Jesus promise us that if when we died, we would go immediately in a disembodied state to be in the presence of God, we now have close to 300 million people around the world who have had near-death experiences. 1 in 25 Americans living today have had one. Now, you cannot explain all of them, in terms of lying or oxygen deprivation to the brain, and here's why. There are so many of them that report knowing things that are verified in the medical chart by doctors, nurses, by people down in the cafeteria when the person died, and by eyewitnesses. They report things that there isn't any way they could have known about those things unless they left their bodies. And all you have to do is read credible accounts of this. And like I said, with stage 4 cancer, I had stage 3, and I survived 3 operations for 3 different cancers. So I really empathize with you, brother or sister. I really do. Please get John Burke's book, Burke, Imagine Heaven. Please get that. I promise you, if you will read that book, it's going to thrill your heart. Because I got to tell you, if you know Jesus Christ, you are in for the time of your life. And I'm not kidding. I know that to be true. And you won't even know you're dead. Most people who die, say hospice nurses, they don't know they've died. They come back. They're out of their bodies, and they look back and they think, what the heck is that? And one guy said, Jesus, it's me. It's my body. And he was looking at his own body and didn't know he was dead. Well, God bless you. It's been good being with my brothers and sisters and other friends at Texas A&M. I sure hope your situation gets better.
On that note, I think we'll close out. Thank you again to Dr. Moreland and Dr. Garcia for a great discussion tonight. I hope for all of those of you who've been watching, you can kind of tell from the discussion that this is a topic that Dr. Moreland and Dr. Garcia have really thought through. And I also hope that last question impresses on everyone watching that this is not merely theoretical. This is something that's going to affect each one of us watching. What I would encourage you to do as we close out is to find someone else who watched. Perhaps you're in a room watching together with someone else, and have a discussion. Don't just let the interesting topic leave you after this evening, but talk about it with someone else and see how it changes your view of the world and your view of your brain and your view of the soul. Thank you again for attending the 2021 Texas A&M Veritas Forum. Thanks, everybody.